The doctor is in. When I decided to do a project on Pine City's doctors, it soon became clear that there were four who seemed to form the backbone of the town's medical care: Dr. Barnum, Dr. Wiseman, Dr. Strati, and Dr. Mock. They each chose to relocate in Pine City, spent their career here, and became such an integral part of the town that even in death they remained. They formed an uninterrupted line of care, with each man's tenure overlapping with the doctor preceding and with the one following. Another thing that made these four special is I had access to some wonderful resources and information that had been gathered close to the source. With Dr. Barnum, it was not only a book written right after the Hinckley fire by a man who had interviewed survivors, but also a genealogical family history that included anecdotal items written by a family member. Mary Louise Wiseman, Dr. Wiseman's wife, created an extensive scrapbook for her grandchildren. It contained photos and memorabilia, along with memories and lengthy handwritten descriptions of life with Dr. Wiseman. There were also hundreds of newspaper clippings. Personal privacy didn't seem to exist during Dr. Wiseman's lifetime. Dr. Strati's career was so long that he's mentioned in all four versions of the local paper. In addition, his daughter Marjorie wrote a summary of his life along with sharing photos and memorabilia. Dr. Mock worked during an era when there was a growing awareness of people's right to privacy, meaning that there was very little public information about Dr. Mock's career. I was thankful that his 8 children were willing to write an account of their dad's life. This is probably a good time to recognize 2 champions of preserving Pine City history. Seated here in Weissman Memorial Park, on a bench in memory of Dr. and Mrs. Strati, are Robert Wiseman Shuey and Marjorie Strati Swanson. Rob passed away in 2022. Marjorie will be 100 next August. Coming up with a presentation on this book was a challenge. There's a lot of information in the book, and my style of telling a story with a mix of prose supplemented with newspaper clippings doesn't work well in this format. So I'm going to give you a brief background on each doctor, highlight some of the stories or information you will find in the book, and look at some topics that would have affected most, if not all of them. Lastly, we will look at 3 doctors that don't fit my narrow category of town doctor, but they each played a unique role in Pine City's history. Albert Eugene Barnum was born in New York in 1852. He attended med school at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He had 4 children. He died while he was still practicing medicine. Dr. Barnum is the only one of the 4 who did not spend his whole career in Pine City. He had a successful practice in Minneapolis in the 1880s. Then he had an accident and was bedridden for a year and a half, during which time all of his patients found new doctors. So he went looking for a place that needed a doctor. Dr. Barnum had a great deal of personal involvement in the 1894 fire that destroyed the town of Hinckley. Word of the Hinckley fire first reached the outside world when at 11 o'clock that night, a railroad handcar carrying 7 survivors arrived in Pine City with the news. Within half an hour, a group that included Dr. Barnum was headed to Hinckley with supplies, while the rest of Pine City prepared to receive an untold number of survivors. A second, equally as dramatic story concerning a different Barnum family member emerged from the Hinckley fire. The second story involved 13-year-old Kate Barnum, who had traveled to Hinckley that day on her own to go school shopping. As her father headed to Hinckley with the group of first responders, Kate's whereabouts were unknown. Spoiler alert, Kate is safe in the end, but her experience involved a harrowing train ride, and she didn't get home for 4 days. Robert Lawrence Wiseman was born in 1874 in Stockton, Minnesota. He went to med school at the University of Minnesota. He had 3 children. Dr. Wiseman also died when he was still working. Being a country doctor in the early 1900s required a great deal of physical stamina. I think Doctors Barnum and Wiseman worked themselves to death. In the spring of 1898, Dr. Wiseman became acting coroner of Pine County, which was a lot of responsibility for a young doctor. Dr. Wiseman had been a qualified doctor for barely a year, and he was only 23 years old. Then, in June of 1898, the sheriff died, and Dr. Wiseman was made acting sheriff in addition to coroner. While he was sheriff, there was a knifing in Carrick, and he captured the attacker, assault and battery and robbery in Sandstone, and he arrested the culprit. The young city slicker doctor turned out to be a pretty good lawman. Dr. Wiseman must have liked the sense of danger and excitement, because in the fall of 1898 he ran for and was elected to the office of coroner. His most famous case was the murder of George Peterson. It occurred in 1899 at Doyle's Saloon in Berrien, and it involved knockout drops, a blind pig, which is an illegal saloon, a man named Black Jack, and removing a dead man's stomach under gunpoint. Dr. Wiseman married Mary Louise Davis in June of 1900. Moving to Pine City was a shock to Dr. Wiseman's new wife. The Wisemans lived on the east side of the train tracks. The blue star marks the spot where their house was. The new Mrs. Wiseman did not share her husband's enthusiasm over his job as coroner. Listen as we hear her own words tell the story. Although our cottage was very pleasant and our yard beautiful with flowers, it was located across the track from the residences and business section of the main part of town. There was a blacksmith shop next door, and across the street was an old-fashioned saloon. One house in the block back of us, although there were other houses further on. I felt very much alone when my coroner or sheriff husband left town on the night train with a revolver in his pocket. All these towns that he visited were quite rough lumber towns, and too often he was called where there had been foul play. Having come from the suburbs of St. Paul, where one never saw an intoxicated person, and everything was peaceful and you had very near neighbors, I used to be so dreadfully scared alone, as you can imagine, especially as the saloon was open most all night, and often fights ensued. At times, when I was alone and miserable for fear of what might happen to Rob and myself, frightened with fear of all the carousing, a drunk would come to the doctor's house to be sewed up, and I would shake so bad at his knock that I could hardly speak through the locked door. For in the early days, 1900s, Pine City was also a lumbering town. Much of the year the river was full of thousands of logs, and the men who worked these logs were taking them to the mills were called lumberjacks. In 1901, Dr. Wiseman's parents moved to Pine City. They bought Slusner's hardware store and renamed it Wiseman and Company. We know it today as Sauser's Hardware. Dr. Wiseman's father and brother Roy ran the store, and Dr. Wiseman moved his office into the hardware store. As was common for the time, Wiseman and Company served not only as a hardware store, but it provided undertaking as well. They had a particularly fine display of caskets. In 1905, Dr. Wiseman helped establish the Pokegama Sanatorium with Dr. Henry Longstreet Taylor. Dr. Taylor was instrumental in developing treatment in Minnesota for people with tuberculosis. He became frustrated with the slow progress by the Minnesota State Legislature to establish sanatoriums, and so in 1905 he used his own money to build a private sanatorium near Pine City on the shores of Lake Pokegama. Elf Kenneth Strady was born in Dawson, Minnesota. He went to med school at the University of Minnesota, and he had 3 children. Day or night, the doctor was always on call. Dr. Strady's telephone answering service was the Northwestern Bell operator. If the doctor and his wife were going to be gone from home in the evening, they would call the operator and tell her where they would be. The Strady house was never locked, so sometimes Constable Korff would quietly open the door of the Strady house and climb the stairs to the bedroom to wake Dr. Strady for a late night house call. Marjorie Strady Swanson shared that nighttime calls frequently lasted the whole night. Dr. Strady wasn't alone in that, as we see in this clipping from the Hanson family history, shared by Judy Hanson-Wolf. On July 4th of 1926, Carl Theodore was born. Esther Luttrell was the midwife, and Dr. Wiseman came from Pine City via horse and sled and stayed overnight because the weather and roads were so bad. Doctors' fees were very different. In 1930, Dr. Strady charged $1 for an office call and $3 for a home visit. By 1948, the charge had gone up to $5 for a rural visit and $3 for an office call. In 1924, a baby delivered at home would cost $20 and later jumped to $25. These fees included the months of prenatal care. He was often paid with a load of wood for his furnace, eggs, chickens, fish, garden produce, or often not at all. After his death, his children found an entire file drawer of unpaid accounts. Ralph Franklin Mock was born in New Prague in 1921. He was the first doctor in town to be born after 1900. He went to med school at the University of Minnesota and had 8 children. Dr. Mock was a bridge between what doctoring had been and what it was to become. House calls disappeared over the course of his career. As people started to expect more services than a single doctor could provide, doctors moved from private practice to a clinic. Dr. Mock mirrored that trend, operating his own practice until 1979 and then joining a clinic. Dr. Mock was a trendsetter. In the early 1950s, Dan Robbins, an employee of the Palmer Paint Company, invented paint by number as a way to sell more paint. It became a huge success as adults all over the country embraced the new hobby. Dr. Mock was one of those adults. The Mock children wrote, when someone in the community died and he was at the scene, he would come home and head upstairs to paste or paint, to work off the pain he felt in losing a patient. As children, we knew not to interfere with his grieving. Transportation was a big deal, especially for Doctors Barnum and Wiseman, who would have had to rely on horses year-round. Mrs. Wiseman wrote, much of the time he was the only doctor serving a very large district in the days of awful roads. At first he kept 5 horses, going over corduroy and sand roads in the summer and using the ice on the river and the lake in the winter. A corduroy road is made by laying tree trunks down side by side, usually just to get you through the swampier bits. Winter was the worst. Even Dr. Strady reverted back to being a horse and buggy doctor then. In an interview with local historian Ann Bach, Dr. Strady is quoted saying, years ago they didn't plow the roads during winter. We used sleds and horses, but when we got stuck, we'd keep going on foot. In later years, when the roads were bad with snow and ice, the farmers sometimes met Dr. Strady on the main road with a tractor, and once with a manure spreader. Mud was also a problem. Mrs. Wiseman again. After heavy rains, he often became mired and carried with him a block and tackle affair to pull the buggy out. But he never failed to answer a call, no matter what the weather. At last came our automobile, the first such machine in town. Hard rubber tires that bumped over terrible roads. For there was no such thing as good roads in horse and buggy days. It was the use of the automobile that brought those. Mrs. Wiseman wrote, by 1920, one could make the trip to St. Paul easily on good roads. It was possible in one day to go down to the hospital, perform an operation, have a good dinner, take in a show or concert, and come home. As roads and cars improved, transporting patients became a possibility. Since there was no ambulance in the county, Dr. Strati ordered a Plymouth car that could be made into one. The front and back seats were split in half, so the right halves could be removed. When he opened the trunk, the doctor could slide the stretcher and the patient into the open space of the car. The patient's head was right next to him as he transported them to a hospital in the Twin Cities. As the Strati house had no garage, Doc Strati parked his car in front of the house, with his physician's bag in the car and the car keys in the ignition, so he could answer an urgent phone call as soon as possible. His car was only stolen once. In the winter, the Holitz garage, which was heated and just across the street, would let Dr. Strati park inside. The earlier papers would print details of the doctor's various cases that they were attending to. While they make interesting reading, they didn't afford people much privacy. Here's a clipping on George Kick. George Kick is reported quite ill at his home just west of town. His ailment is appendicitis, and Wednesday afternoon an operation was performed by Doctors Stefan of Hinckley and Wiseman of this place. It is hoped that he will speedily recover. George's grandson, Harold Kick, mentions this operation in his memoirs. In February of 1906, George needed to have his appendix removed. I heard that the operation took place on the kitchen table of his own home. The operation was difficult. He contracted pneumonia and died on March 6, 1906. Mrs. Richardson found an unusual way to injure herself. While returning to her home on Tuesday evening, Mrs. A. Richardson fell and struck her chin on a baking powder can she was carrying, which cut a severe gash. The injured woman's neighbors rendered her all possible aid. Dr. Barnum was immediately called and attended to the wound, which was bleeding profusely. Life was dangerous. This clipping ends like so many of them do. The 12-year-old daughter of Adolph Sommers fell from a buggy Wednesday and as a result has a very bad scalp wound. Dr. Wiseman was called and dressed the wounds, and the girl is doing as well as could be expected. While I'm unsure of Dr. Barnum's opinion on the topic, there's lots of evidence that hunting and fishing were important to the other three. Here's Dr. Strati with some fishing buddies. And it looks like Dr. Mock has a couple of keepers. Dr. Wiseman's enthusiasm for hunting was so strong that he apparently found it to have medicinal value. In 1909, this notice appeared in the paper. On account of poor health, I'm obliged to take a vacation of a couple of weeks. 2 weeks later, there was clarification of what this rejuvenating vacation consisted of. Dr. Wiseman and Dr. Stefan have taken 2 weeks off and gone on a duck hunting expedition to the northern part of the state. They left early Monday on the early train. Dr. Wiseman and 4 friends departed Sunday's early morning train for Crimson. From there, they go by team 9 miles to the Ed Nestor logging camp to hunt big game. Here's hoping they succeed in bagging their lawful share, 1 deer and 1 moose for each hunter. Can you imagine dragging all those dead animals on the train? Three doctors who each made a unique contribution to Pine City. In 1909, an unusual couple moved to Pine City. Dr. Albert August Tofty and his wife, Dr. Josephine Bingham Tofty. A woman doctor would have been rare in 1909. It is estimated that in 1910, only about 6% of doctors in the United States were women. The doctors Tofty set up an office in what had originally been Otto Kowalski's saloon. They soon moved to 3rd Avenue. In 1918, Dr. Tofty enlisted and was put in charge of an army hospital in Ohio. His wife soon joined him. Dr. Francis Callahan was the superintendent of the Pokegama Sanatorium. The Callahans raised their 3 daughters while living at the sanatorium. They lived at the sanatorium located on Pokegama Lake for most of the year. During the summer, they lived in town in the Bead House. The Bead House, in addition to being in town, was also located on a lake, Cross Lake. The sanatorium, this is the doctor's house, and the sanatorium closed in 1943 due to war difficulties, and it never reopened. The Callahans relocated to Walker, Minnesota, where Dr. Callahan worked at the state sanatorium there. In 1937, Dr. Nethercott bought what had been the Busselmeyer family home and converted it to a 15-bed hospital. In 1958, Dr. Nethercott sold Lakeside Memorial Hospital to Dr. Eric Bloffus. The building became a rest home. Dr. Nethercott died in 1963, and his wife Florence set up a scholarship in his memory.